if the battery, I'll check every now and then how we are for time and that, but this is how it starts. So when you're asking me, how do I get this going, there's no editing, so I try to keep it raw, so I will look, if there's a crowd out there, hopefully one day, that will be nice, but it really is to have you guys here. So Murray, what I found really cool about this particular episode that I'm doing is, up till now, the podcasts or the videos that I've done have all been schools that I was either related to from my own background as a child or went to, or schools that I have worked at since becoming an adult. So what was quite nice with those is I always had like a direct link of a story, or I knew the history of the school. And I started with Jeppy when I worked at Jeppy, and as you probably know, Jeppy, like you guys, being a monastic boys' school, the stories and the legends that come out of these schools is amazing. So why I'm so excited about this one with you guys and hopefully the rest of the team tomorrow is there's an amazing story, and I'll bring this up probably the best way I can. While I was working at Jeppy, Spud was out, and it just blew my mind. Like, often we would get kids coming to do a tour of Jeppy, boys with their folks, but they were always constantly referring to the movie Spud and Michaelhouse, which I was like, you know, our job was to try and convince them to not go to Michaelhouse, but stay with us at Jeppy. So we created this little tool that we had. So Payne Hall in Jeppy is this beautiful, I don't know if you've ever been inside Payne Hall, it's such an amazing building. So what we would always go is, like, my opening line was like, yeah, Michaelhouse has got Spud, but we've got Harry Potter, because it's like much more like a Harry Potter type line. So that was our line of like trying to keep people from wanting to go to Michaelhouse, because Jeppy was at that time, all these young boys, all they wanted to do was go to Michaelhouse. So I'm going to lead off with that, because that was where, and as you know, my cousin is at Michaelhouse, Matthew. So I've always had this kind of an interest in the school, but it's very much around that Spud environment that I think a lot of South Africans got to really kind of start seeing Michaelhouse as this school or this place.
You're right. I mean, it very definitely put Michaelhouse on the map in so many ways, which I think were probably unintended. I mean, from the perspective of marketing a school like Michaelhouse, it's often quite easy to fall into the trap of just assuming, well, everybody knows what Michaelhouse is, where it is, what we do, and the truth is that's not the truth.
Yeah.
And Spud very definitely catapulted us into kind of a front and center of a public consciousness. Interesting. I kind of, my role with the school as a part of the marketing function, it really kick-started when the Spud phenomenon was at its height and at its peak. And it's something that I obviously took a fair amount of interest in just kind of tracking what sort of impact that might have on the registrations that you were talking about up front. I mean, it's just an interesting anecdote. The film was premiered at pretty much the same time that my brother and sister-in-law were thinking of high schools to send their son to. And we were, for various reasons, we were lucky enough to be invited to the premiere in Durban, and John van der Reyt and John Cleese were there. And it was quite a red carpet event. And my sister-in-law came out and said, no, there's no chance on earth that my son is going to that school. And it was then up to my brother and her, who were both old boys of the school, to kind of say, but hang on, this is not a documentary about Michaelhouse. It's not a film about Michaelhouse at all. It's a big boarding adventure. It's kind of it's a big conglomerate of these boarding war stories. So I always like to say that if you had been a boarder literally anywhere on earth at any time in the last 500 years, you would relate. You know all the characters, you recognize the people, the war stories are your own. And I think that's what, if it had been a story about Michaelhouse, I don't think it would have been nearly as digestible or readily received by the marketplace. It wouldn't have been translated into other languages if it had just been about Michaelhouse. It's a far bigger story, and it just happens to be written by a Michaelhouse old boy, and the first film almost coincidentally just happens to have been filmed at the school. So when I then said about the project of plotting, well, what sort of negative or positive impact outside of my sister-in-law just saying no, look, in the end the boys came to Michaelhouse, but was what kind of impact did it have on registrations? And the truth is, it didn't really have a very much of a positive or a negative impact on the way families approach the decision-making process, which I always find quite interesting. But what did happen was, for example, I'd get a phone call in the holidays, let's say from a lady on her way down from Joburg to the beach. She's got 4 daughters, they've all just watched Spud, and can they come and see the school? And your sort of immediate response is, well, why would we facilitate that 4 daughters but genetically, I guess the chance of 4 daughters
mothers one
having
day.
20 sons one day between them, well,
Yeah.
why not? And so often, and I'm sure you'll agree, that the conference that we're at right now, to kind of contextualize where we're sitting, is we're an Independent Schools Marketing Association conference, and I think that a lot of marketers of schools often fall into the trap of, how can I pull one over my competitor schools right now? Instead of maybe taking the longer view of when I'm finished and done with this job, in what kind of space will I leave the perception of the brand? It's a far bigger picture, I think, and especially for the older schools that people might work in,
exactly.
a lot of the others that are here at the school with us. So Spud, hugely interesting time for me to join the marketing effort at Michaelhouse. I always remember kind of just looping it in. I always remember as a 13, 14-year-old boy at Michaelhouse, sitting in English lessons, and the Gov, played by John Cleese, taught me English for my first 3 years at Michaelhouse. I remember thinking as a very young teenage boy, wow, if they ever make a film about this place, they have to cast John Cleese in the role.
So he was really like it.
So, well, I have to tell you, so obviously I was over the moon. I couldn't believe it when I saw, wow, they've cast John Cleese in the role. But when I tell you that he was so disappointing, he was nowhere near as interesting and attention grabbing as Chunky. Chunky was the original the original Gov. I think Chunky died around about this time last year, and it was incredible that the types of people that turned out of his memorial service just down the road from the school, just because of that kind of explosive, interesting personality he was. I think he was a very difficult man, but which is quite well portrayed in the books and the film. But wow, you hung on to every word you ever said. I can't say if we ever learnt anything, but wow, we never missed a word. Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah, you
I'm
did.
sure we did. Yeah.
And you learned those. The previous video I did with Tom Hamilton, who's the CEO of Army Schools. Him and I spoke quite a bit about the difference between education and schooling, and I think those kind of characters that we've all experienced in our school time is schooling.
Yeah.
Those lessons are school lessons.
Absolutely.
You're learning about life through these amazing characters at school, and that's, part and parcel of why I'm doing this. And so, jumping off this, but well, jumping off it, we can always come back to it. But your background, you're obviously an old boy. You married to your wife who works at a school down the road, so you fully, this is intrinsically in you. This giving back and being part of this world is really special.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, I'm from a family of teachers. There are a lot of teachers in my family, and I still think of it as without doubt, the most noble profession there is. And because of that, I sometimes think teachers should be prepared to do what they do for free, because it's a calling. But by the same token, the other side of the coin is that they should all be paid R1 million a month, because it's such an incredibly important role. I just never received the calling to be a teacher. So for me to be doing the more corporate aspect of the way our schools operate these days, in a school environment, it's just couldn't be better.
Yeah,
it's a dream come true. So
your statement there is exactly, it hits home, because I've never been able to be a teacher. I've worked with corporates. I've been in and out of all that, corporates and consulting and all of that. But one thing that has been a constant has been my love for, or my fallback, if you want to call it that, into education.
Yeah.
Not as an educator, because I don't have that skill set in the classroom, but I do it through coaching. So I love coaching sports.
Yeah.
I find I'm able to get my lessons across through coaching, but it's similar to you. There's some kind of a link inside me to schools.
it's special places.
They are, and you mentioned the R1 million a month. I fully agree, in the sense that without good teachers, the ones that, like you mentioned, the Gov or these kind of teachers, those are the ones that create the next generation's love for society and love for school. Plays that bigger role than just learning book smart stuff.
Yeah.
That's important.
I guess the point is that these are rambling and hopefully interesting conversations, but what you're talking about there is also, for me, one of the big worries around what I think is the fad of the success of online learning these past 20 months or so. There's nothing on earth, you can show me all the graphs, all the stats, nothing on earth will convince me that there's anything successful about it. There may have been some boys and girls who did well learning online, but I'll always wonder how much better they would have done if they'd been learning in the good old-fashioned forum. When in the earliest days of teaching and learning, it happened in a forum. That was the point. It's a very human exchange. Teaching and the receiving of that teaching, the learning, those are human, very, very human interactions that can't be done down a pipe. I mean, I look at the content of a 40-minute lesson is probably 15 minutes.
Yeah.
But like you said, the stuff which we really learned, that we really remembered, was the other 25 minutes of stuff that was happening. What was in the book, we've probably most of us forgotten that, but we remember everything else. That was the learning.
Yeah.
And that stuff doesn't happen. It's totally lost. You're dropping a penny down a bottomless well teaching online.
Yeah.
Those things are not
Yeah,
happening.
you're right. I think there will probably always be cases for homeschooling, online learning, whether the child has issues, whether it be physically, emotionally.
On a case-by-case basis,
exactly.
of
I agree.
course,
Yeah,
of course it's true.
But what you're saying there, I can't agree more. That without good schools, and that's kind of the mission that I'm doing this behind is, and this is a private school environment, like you said, but my kids go to government school, and I've worked with like the likes of Jeppy, and what's important there is we've always felt that whether it's private schooling or government schooling in South Africa's context, we need good schools.
Yeah.
So we need these stories to be told, because we need parents to like your sister-in-law, who's like, I'm never thinking of going there. You're like, no, you're missing the point, because it's not just about that. That's part and parcel of it. But there's a bigger picture to what happens around it. And those are the legendary tales. So I hope that just sitting with you now, it's so amazing that, and I knew this would happen. I knew that I'm going to meet people that I wouldn't have worked with. I mean, I met you at the last conference, and again, but briefly, and then like really only yesterday properly, and I can already see that I knew exactly that by meeting with you guys, I was onto something, because you guys get it. That for me is just, it's really, so like you said, it might be rambling, but it's important that people out there find their story, or the parents know that their child could be that next Spud story.
It's interesting, because another question pops into my mind exactly on the back of what you've been talking about. I am often in my interactions with kind of my co-evils from school, the guys who are more or less of my generation, who would have been taught by Chunky, the original Gov himself. One of the first questions is always, so, hey Murray, are there still teachers like that at Michaelhouse? And at first it would take me 5 or 10 seconds, and I'd think about it, and the sad answer that I have to give now is no, because they're going to get fired. If they, I mean, those teachers, the ones that we're talking about right now, well, not even the boozers, the things they said and did in class, which were really the or I guess you could call it the educational hook that they kind of put the bait on for us to swallow the learning. They'd be put in jail, they'd be fired, they'd be marched out of, they'd be drummed out of any school. It's a different world. So I don't mean that there aren't inspirational teachers, but teachers who are the Gov kind, and those guys are just totally off the wall, probably flirting with the law even as they go about it. And in particular in this hypersensitive, my only story kind of world, those are important conversations. You can't downplay that. But I think it's created quite an environment of fear in the way teachers do that very human engagement.
Or limited to the
yeah. It is worrying. It is what it is, but it often worries me. You're never going to get that real juice.
Yeah, I suppose the other issue we probably also find ourselves in South Africa is that we've got this influx of children, because there's just more and more kids needing to get school, but not. I know in the private sector there's a lot more schools being built, but on the government side there isn't schools being built, and that is a problem that we're facing.
If anything, they're closing.
Yeah, and I mean, we here at this conference. What's so fascinating, because I'm involved in my role in private school, but then there's obviously sitting at a government school on the exco there on the governing body. What's interesting is I see the total difference where private schools are like desperately trying to find their target market and talk to them, and like you said earlier, there's this competition between schools. Yet on the government school side, there's almost like too many kids, and you're still trying to sift out. A large part of it is because there's no government funding really for education. You need school fee paying parents. Yeah. So it's still the same thing in that you need school fees to run private schools. So you're looking for parents who can afford the fees, and you're looking for parents who can afford your fees in the government sector. But in the government sector, you've got 1,000 plus children applying per year for one single entry point grade, whereas some of the private schools around here don't even have 1,000 people in the school from grade triple naught to matric.
Yeah, that's right.
It's so. I mean, have you only ever been in the private school sector?
Yeah.
So what was your school, varsity life? I mean, how did you?
Obviously, in my very earliest days at junior school, I was at a state school, but I finished off my prep school career at a private school, and then from there to Michaelhouse and university. So, other than the very earliest days, only in the private school environment.
And varsity, what, KZN?
Yeah, at Maritzburg Varsity,
Maritzburg,
yeah. Before it became UKZN, it was still UNP in those days. Yeah, good days.
Yeah. And your wife's also in education?
Yes, so she is a qualified teacher, and she did spend some time teaching in the UK. It was at that time where most young graduates would leave South Africa and go and spend their 2, 3 or 4 years spreading their wings over there in the UK, and so she did teach there. And she came back with a view to teaching, but she always wanted to get into the sort of the counselling side of things. And as much as she had an opportunity to cut her teeth in that space in the UK, she really battled with the limited experience she had to get into a school. This was now just after the turn of the century. It sounds very old-fashioned to say it that way, a long time ago.
It's only 21 years.
Yeah. So she then found herself in the medical repping industry and kind of progressed from there into product management, and from there into kind of a passion and interest and a real flair for marketing.
Yeah.
So she now runs one of our major feeder schools now, is Clifton Nottingham Road, which is 10, 15 k's down the road from us. So a lot of people accuse us of cartel activity, but there she is.
Yeah, I was quite impressed last night when I saw it, because I didn't realize when you said you were all driving down, I didn't realize it was like a family thing.
Yeah, it's a family outing to the beach.
I find that so cool. I think see, for me, what's important is that people out there understand that it's these kind of families like yourselves that are fully immersed in the industry that are the ones that are driving the passion for, and that's, I mean, we spoke about it. I think the key word is that passion or that calling for education.
Yeah.
If you don't,
it's a passion role.
Totally. I mean, it's not financially going to set you up as a billionaire or anything like that.
No,
It's really passion. Sorry guys, there's lots of ladies, lots of noise. We're filming an interview.
Are you serious?
Would you like to be in it for 2 seconds? It doesn't get edited.
Open camera.
So if you're on, you're on.
Okay, cool. What are you interviewing for?
We're telling school stories about Michaelhouse. Do you have any stories about Michaelhouse?
No, just how you
We might have dated those
David's
which is true.
Yeah. Well, that's the whole competition thing. Because there isn't.
Yeah. So I mean, as much as we're talking about passion, but that's what we're paid to do, I suppose. So,
it makes it easier if it's something that
mercenary.
you can be passionate about.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Obviously. Yeah.
And a typical day for you guys? What's your typical day like?
I suppose it would be easier to describe it as a typical year. I mean, it's very, very cyclical. It's driven by the sort of the checkpoints in the cycle, which kind of start off with the early communication with the list of pre-registrations. So I mean, it's not peculiar to Michaelhouse, but the family can and more it seems to be the case, register literally the day a boy is born. So if I would look forward to 2034, we're already on about 50 or 60 registrations, which it always interests me because, I mean, not many of us even know where we're going to be on Sunday afternoon before carte blanche, but think about 2034 it's mind staggering. But anyway, so we'll start off around about June, getting in touch with those families, and just checking, are you still keen, are these still your contact details? If so, this is kind of the roadmap through to the offer of places or potential offering of places. That's in June. Then from July we kind of kickstart the tours, the interviews. At the same time, I'll be working my way into 12 or 15 out of our major feeder schools, do a bit of evangelizing, a little razzle-dazzling with their grade 6 boys. Kind of start to sell the dream, get them to imagine how Michaelhouse might be an option for them as a kind of place to spend 5 exciting growth years. And then the idea is for them to go and do the moving and shaking at home and convince mum and dad that when I come to their backyard for one of the live parent information events, that mum and dad have been compelled enough by Johnny to come and listen to the more serious conversations around what it means to board, the little speed hunts, the dreads around the fees and all of those sorts of things. Those are the places we can erode them, and the real trick from there is to then entice those families onto our side of the fence, onto our campus, which is where we really start to erode all the apprehensions and the dread, because suddenly they're confronted with the space, the facilities, polite boys who are looking ideally sort of well dressed, and they start imagining, oh, Johnny might be like that in 4 or 5 years' time, and that's where. So I suppose our gold standard and what you asked about a daily routine, it's not really set, but everything we do on a daily basis is towards that big objective of getting a family onto our side of the fence. Either for their tour or their interview, or if they're not quite ready for that stage, for one of the information events where they go, yes, I do want to be interviewed. And that takes us through to the sort of offering of places and scholarships, which normally happens around about mid-April. And then we wash, rinse, dry, reuse the following year. But what keeps it exciting and stimulating, I've toured and interviewed close on 3,500 boys, which even as I think of it just sounds so dull and boring, but they're all different. And their families are all different, their context, their aspirations, and that's what really keeps it interesting and exciting.
I think that again, the advantage you have of having gone through the mill there is that you can probably see in those boys, or in those families, the potential of another story, or the potential of another successful.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's true. Look, it's not a science, and from time to time we do mess it up quite badly, but I think we are getting better at it, and the success story is definitely, when it comes to identifying a boy who might not necessarily have found or unearthed or turned over the stone which will reveal what he's good at, what he enjoys, but what we're really looking for, I guess, is that boy with if he were a dog, he'd have a waggy tail and a glossy coat, and his tongue would be lolling out, and he'd have a big wet nose. We're looking for that kind of boy, and most people get it right, I think. Get that match, which is an important one.
And I mean, have you learned that yourself, or is it something that you, as a school, have kind of gone and said, this is the kind of boy we're looking for, or is it kind of been more organic?
I think at first it was almost an accidental or incidental process where we would go, that's the boy we want. And then when you've kind of got enough of those guys, you aggregate that and you go, but what exactly was it? Let's be a bit more conscious, a little bit more deliberate around what was it that we saw in that boy, so that we can take it back to the lab and reproduce what we're looking for and see if we can find it more often.
No, it's like it fascinates me how, again, like your dynamics that you're kind of operating in, there's definitely like similarities with like a jet blue I've worked, or cares or that, but then there's not. Then there's this other side of it that is, and I suppose that will be kind of lead on to the next thing of the whole boarding. And I mean, I would imagine the majority of boys, or if not all of them, stay for termly boarding.
So it's a full boarding environment. No day boys, no weekly boarders.
So I mean, they literally become a family for 5 years.
That's right.
So I mean, they're alone. I mean, that's how do you find it? Like the early days of that grade 8 experience, is getting that, like, I suppose, that paternal type of management of the guys. So it must be quite interesting, I learned.
Yeah, it is quite interesting. And often the perception is that grade 8 year, that first year of boarding, is the toughest one. And in many ways it is. It is a tough environment, not because it's horrible. And I still, one of the things which we try very hard to constantly erode is the idea that boarding schools are punishment for boys who haven't eaten their vegetables. And that's not the case. It's which is also, just a slight digression, one of the reasons why we shied away from certainly the second Spud film being filmed at Michaelhouse, because it was starting to become a little bit too closely associated with the idea that being a teenage boy, in particular a teenage boy in a boarding context, is almost universally a time of angst and stress and concern, which it isn't. Yes, those things are all true and they're all present, but on balance, in general, it's fun. It's a time of real growth and learning in exciting ways. Aside from the fact that yes, it's tough and there are challenges.
Yeah, I must say, I never got to go to a boarding school. We lived. My parents still live in the same house, which is literally they lived there for 50 years.
That's incredible.
They literally live about 2.5 k's from where we all went to school with my entire family, my wife's entire family. So it's kind of like the same environment.
There's so many stories right there.
Yeah, that was so cool about it, is that we were almost like in a boarding environment, but we also lived in our houses so close to the school.
The way you painted it is exactly how I said. I often sell it to a family that way. Like your boys come and they sleep and do their homework and whatever in their house, but it's like living in a cul-de-sac.
Yeah,
all your friends there.
And kid on the road.
That's exactly what it's done.
Yeah, so the two key things that I was fascinated about Michaelhouse is one, obviously the role that Spud played, because I was kind of on the other end of that at Jeppy, where you could clearly see this impact of that film on people's mindset of boarding school. Boarding school, I think, in South Africa literally spiked for a bit of that period. They must,
I'd love to see the general analytics at the time.
Yeah, it's probably an anecdotal assumption, but I think it must have, because everyone we spoke to in that period we could see. And then secondly, which is probably also something you can touch on now, and then we can finish it off quite soon. We've been going for it's quite long. It's
just
only
25 minutes.
It feels longer, but it's quite cool. There's a lot of stuff we're chatting about. But the other thing is, we were driving down to the coast for the one holiday, and Matt said to us, well, if you're going down, come past and stay over. And what blew my mind there was, it was like the December holiday.
Yeah.
And there was this life happening in the campus where there was a family who regularly, I think that he said at the time, they regularly came as part of their December holiday from Cape Town.
Yeah.
And they stay in, I think, the headmaster's house or something like that. And they bring
every year
motorbikes.
Yeah,
they come with this huge trailer in this big combi type car, and they spend a week or whatever.
Country club vibe.
Yeah, and it was what blew my mind was that I was like, that's crazy. Why would you come here for your holiday? But then that cul-de-sac type environment where there was all these kids around, and when I say all, there wasn't hundreds, but there was
there were enough for
to make
game
friends.
of touch in the afternoon, and
hockey. On the second day we were there, they all went down and played hockey. They had a game of hockey with my daughters we left there, and my kids were like, that was like the weirdest thing. Like we were playing hockey on this cool Astro, like in the holidays at a school, and they went
like in our cousin's backyard kind of thing.
Yeah, and then they were on their they were all on on motorbikes and bicycles, and they're off. And what's really cool about it is you don't have to worry about your kids, because your campus is, it's stunning. There's just so much to do there.
Yeah.
So that holiday question is, I find that's another value add that people don't even know. I'm not advertising for people to go on holiday to Michaelhouse, but but it is. There's a similar to those 4 girls you mentioned who the parents brought, they wanted to see in school. There's this other life in the campus that obviously takes place.
Yeah, just on that, two kind of their anecdotes. We have a staff member whose wife was related to another staff member at the time that I was at the school, and obviously so her cousins were then boys at the school. This is in the mid and late 90s, and a big part of the family decision for them to leave Joburg and come basically to the backwaters. It's beautiful, but it's the backwaters. Was her childhood memories of visiting the school as a little boy.
Yeah.
And that was pivotal as part of their decision. Well, should we change our lives, take our kids down there and go and live there? So that was a big one. The other one, which often makes me laugh, we had one of our prospective parent information events in Hillcrest a couple of weeks ago, and we try wherever possible to have those events at an old boy's house or a current family's home, because I think that tells its own story, that they're willing to open their home to 50, 60, 70, in some cases up to 100 strangers, kind of tell them a bit more about how they feel about Michaelhouse. Anyway, this was at an old boy's home. The old boy's wife is Swedish, and she was telling the story to the room full of prospective parents how she was fresh off the boat, had just arrived from Sweden and South Africa, I forget why, I think she'd come to do postgraduate studies. She met this guy and she says, wow, incredibly good looking, very charming, but his first date he said to me, do you want to come and see my old school? And she was like, no. Why on earth would I want to go see your old school on a date? And anyway, they did go on their first date to the school, and now they're married and they have 2 sons at the school themselves. And that's just such a funny story. But yes, there is this other life going on there, and it's a base level. It's so many different base level stories in so many different people's lives, which is the thing I'm getting at.
Yeah, and that's the thing, like you said, like they go on their first date to the school, but I can fully see it, because I could see people sitting on the embankments by where the Astro and the cricket field is there, the trees. It's pretty romantic. You've got the train track, and it's quite a picturesque, and you've got the view into the valleys. I know you said it's backwaters, but there's something romantic about that. Like it's in a weird way. I could see, especially if you're an old boy, and you could imagine some kid when he's in school, going through school, and he's like, one day I'm going to bring my girlfriend to come and be, it's like I'm going to sit here with her under the tree and we're going to enjoy this together. And someone could tell that to me, like that's why they did that. And I get it. I think it's really cool. How do you see technology? So the campus is you guys are celebrating 125 years.
Yeah.
So it's been around. I mean, I was trying to do some reading up, and I saw it was originally
In Pietermaritzburg.
and then moved up there. But so education, like you said earlier, it is changing. But how do we keep these stories and what we do in terms of marketing and telling school stories alive? Technology is an easy way, obviously.
Yeah.
But do you see kids? You can imagine the VR goggles, with the future happening. Do you think that's going to impact the stories in a negative way or a positive way going forward?
Look, one of my memories of my very earliest days at Michaelhouse, we were, I think, one of the very first, if not the first year, where IT was a matric subject option. And I remember Mr. Goulding, our IT teacher, I won't repeat verbatim what he told me, but he basically said everything I touched on a computer really messed it up. So I'm what you call a techno weenie, and in many ways I'll shy away from technology, but at the same time it does interest me, and I do always see the powers and advantages that it could offer, not just the marketing of a school like Michaelhouse, but the way in which those stories are kept alive. But then I also look at Michaelhouse, it's a place which has survived to this point 125 years down the line because of these anecdotal stories, despite just being an amplification of those stories. I don't think we needed a film that was going to break box office records in South Africa to carry on telling those stories. They're stories that'll always have their own energy and impetus. And I suppose the question you want to ask is, well, how far is it necessary to have those stories broadcast? And I suppose the answer is a piece of string, really, because why would we want everybody on earth to know about it? But also, what advantage would we gain from that? Because there are only ever going to be 125, 130 odd boys each year coming to the school.
I think you've touched on. So I always find this balance that you have to find, because sometimes you don't want every single story to be put out on every single channel, because there's got to remain this legendary folklore / urban legend. Schools, I think in South Africa, a lot of schools are built on that folklore type of. I mean, like you say, like the true Gov wasn't portrayed exactly as you remember him in that movie.
Yeah.
And that's because you had your own experiences.
Yeah.
So they couldn't quite capture it, but they captured it enough for people who weren't there to. But I think that's why we don't want to do everything, because I think we would kill off some of the stories or some of the value by almost diluting it too far.
The old white noise. I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
And then it's not special anymore.
Yeah.
I suppose. No. Not that I'm suggesting that the school is a special place. All schools are special places. I'm not suggesting that it's more special than the next, but its own special is the thing that I suppose it needs to be rapidly safeguarded. But it's a thing that you just want to keep unique and peculiar to that place.
And I suppose the tough question is, do you see yourselves as peculiarly different to the obvious Hilton, Kersney in your circles? Or, I mean, that's the hard part for you guys, I suppose, because if you're coming, I'm an uninformed, uneducated consumer up in Joburg, I hear of Michaelhouse, Hilton, Kersney, to a degree,
Yeah.
Treverton, although that's co-ed and slightly different, but they're all these enigmas of schools that are in the Midlands of KZN, this beautiful place that you hear of out there, but we in St. Charles, we hear of them and we're like, oh, we pack them all as one.
Yeah.
So how do you guys, because you're all very different, but you're not, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. So I think that there are so many similarities, but in the end, for all of our schools, for every similarity, there are probably 2 or 3 differences.
Okay.
I mean, they're the very obvious ones, boys only high schools. For Hilton and us, all boys, all boarding schools. I mean, there's a handful on earth, probably not even 10 schools like Hilton and Michaelhouse. And even within that very small sample of schools around the world, 10 odd, we're all pretty different.
Yeah.
Even for those very significant similarities, there are lots of differences. The differences in geography, quite aside from the difference in the story, the history of the school, the geography, where our boys come from, their received stories, there's so many differences.
And do you think that and we forgot to mention college. Maritzburg College is another one.
Wow,
I mean, that's I think of the others, they're all private, and Maritzburg is not.
Yeah.
But again, as a Joburg person, I would bet 80% of Joburg people who know of these schools probably don't see Maritzburg College as a the government school. They probably assume it's just the part and parcel of the other schools in the
Yeah,
Midlands.
I guess I'd imagine you're probably right.
Yeah, because it's they're all these legendary schools coming from there. So, I mean, how do we how do we get these schools? Because and people touched on it too on this conference, some of the speakers, overseas markets. Because we don't want to convert every boy from around the world into becoming a South African.
Yeah.
But we can do our part.
We know it's a big problem for English public schools.
Yeah.
Who are catering to the Russian oligarch markets, the oil barons and sheikhs from the Middle East. Huge audience, big traction in China, Korea, and what's happened there's kind of been a flip where a lot of the Russian oligarchs are saying, but hang on, the school that we've invested up to £50,000 a year in is not an English school anymore. 40% and more of the kids are not English. And so there I think we South African schools would run a fairly real, a significant danger of not being South African, and I'm all for South African schools. In fact, I've noticed, accelerated by COVID, but it had been happening already before COVID, was this real growing interest in a boarding school, in particular private boarding school in South Africa, from Germany, huge interest from Germany, the UK, certainly since COVID we've been fielding registrations from Canada, Luxembourg, Switzerland,
Netherlands has been one. I know
Netherlands, we have a boy currently we interviewed yesterday from Holland.
Yeah.
And what those sorts of boys bring, especially the European boys, they arrive in our context, they speak 4 languages fluently. They're all accomplished musicians, they're worldly wise.
And similar sports as well, so for them to get into the culture of football, cricket, basketball, rugby,
there's so many touch points for them to really spark and get going with, and yet there's so much different which is appealing about a South African education for those families, and then they in turn bring a built-in exchange program every day. They're thinking differently, they eat differently at home, and now our South African boys get to sit in a space. It is a criticism that I have with the boarding school model, is that the boys can quite easily become inward looking, despite all the best efforts of the staff to kind of say, look, there's a world outside beyond our gates, and let's engage online and let's ask questions. It becomes a very inward looking environment, and the in-house jokes are kind of rife and those sorts of things. So they have outside boys in our educational spaces is a big plus, but and I don't know what the number is, but I think we always have to be wary of there being a tipping point, which it's no longer what we know and love.
I guess you're right. There's got to have this balance between wanting this outside world influence and value, but not going too far.
Yeah.
And then how do you see the role of you guys helping the guys when they leave the trip to get started in the whether it's and there's schools that have got programs linked to Hong Kong varsities, American varsities, English varsity, or European varsities. I mean, do you guys see that as a big part of your role?
So, I mean, there are a couple of prongs to that answer. On the one hand, it's not a great number yet. There's not a groundswell, but we're getting better at it. Is introducing boys into what is a privileged environment at Michaelhouse who are not privileged boys, and that's wonderful. Except that after 5 years, then what? So that's a space that we've had to become quite conscious of and give a lot of thought towards. So on the one hand, for the boys whose families, where the means are not so much of a challenge, we have a very active counselling department. Our school counsellor is very, very engaged and involved and sits on a number of boards at universities overseas, so he's incredibly well versed right through from as early as grade 10 in preparing boys for overseas university applications or not, just what else is out there other than the sort of I think the one speaker today was telling us about her dad's advice to study a BA and then an LLB and then get into commerce, I think, whatever the case may be. It's a different world, but the counselling department obviously caters for a lot of boys to look beyond their 5 years within the gates at Michaelhouse. And we've noticed, it's not a thing that I'm necessarily excited about because I feel strongly about the fact that we're not educating our boys for export. But since the stone throwing, the fees must fall movement at our universities, 5 or 6 years ago, there's been a fairly marked increase in the number of boys who are not going to South African universities after their school. And that's great for families who can afford it. Overseas university is expensive. Before you've eaten anything or laying your weary head down on a pillow or anything like that, it's expensive. But the real question that I want to build up to is that's not an option for every boy. In fact, even a South African university education is not an option for every Michaelhouse boy these days. And the same is true of boys at other schools. So in our old boy space, we spent a lot of time putting our heads together over the last year or so, looking at ways of creating mentorship programs, very meaningful mentorship programs, internship programs, to prepare boys for the right career choice, beyond just the sort of 1 or 2 lessons a cycle with the counsellor, and actually giving them a chance to get the grease under their nails, roll up their sleeves, and see whether they want to be a diesel mechanic or not. Actually try it. So that's a space where we've innovated and it's evolved a lot, and we've got big plans, big dreams for that moving forward. We've got a couple of online platforms which will really drive that, the mentorships and the internships, and then that to kind of develop all the way through to introducing a job board. So look, it smacks a lot of the old school tie and all of those sometimes quite sinister connotations that go along with the secret handshakes and all of those sorts of things, but yeah, it's just a world of opportunity that we want to open up as part of the extension of the story, I guess.
100%. And I don't think you guys ever have to ever consider that as like an old school tie or old boys club, because what we've spoken about for the last 40 odd minutes is the fact that you guys are trying to expand the value of the boys, but so with that mentality, simply by affording them access to the guys who have been through that before them, is by no means a secret handshake. That's simply saying you've come through this mold of this campus or this school to be given this mindset of trying to grow. So by the people out there went through the same thing, so they're in the same mindset. So they're not now putting you back into it. They're literally saying, we can take you from this point to that point, and then you can go to the next point. Yeah. So I don't believe. I really think it's a great thing to do.
I mean, part of it's the Club for Life vision. So it's not just 5 years of pretty expensive education for your mum and dad. It's a club for life, and one of the sort of drivers of that vision is that the way in which we create these interactions, these opportunities, is for the advantage of old boys, and particularly young old boys, but in particular to the greater good. That's specifically there. It's written down in our vision. It's to make the world a better place.
Yeah, and I mean that goes back to the thing of we need more entrepreneurs. We need more people doing this because one entrepreneur can employ 10, 20 people.
Just like that.
One person looking for a job is one person being employed. It's a scale of 1 to 10.
Yeah.
So what you guys are doing is actually, I think people who turn around and say it's the wrong way of doing it or saying it's an old boys club, they're not seeing the bigger picture in the correct way, because you're going the other way around. You're saying, no, by us doing this, we can equip one person to get to a point where they can employ 10 people, rather than one person going to go for a job that looks after just themselves.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case.
So I come from a background of entrepreneurism and mentoring in it. So for me, I get kind of goosebumps when I hear it, because I'm like, that's exactly what everyone should be doing. So kudos to you guys. I think that's your role now. And you said you're moving into the
so I won't leave my marketing and admissions roles behind. The way we see it is that this interaction with the old boys, there'll be a lot of synergies, a lot of economies, and in many ways, most of them unconscious up until fairly recently, they've been happening anyway, but almost accidentally, whereas now we're just going to be a lot more purpose-driven. They're all running in parallel to the same objective in the end, the Club for Life, I guess.
That's really cool. I think, look, I've got to do tomorrow, hopefully with Matt and the guys at the campus, so we're now almost 45 minutes. So I mean, if I did 45 minutes to an hour with them as well, that's going to be a really...
It's going to be a big old podcast.
I'm going to do part 1 and part 2, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
So I'll do one, yours will be part 1 and then theirs will be part 2. But thank you for this. I mean, like I said, this was new ground for me, because people that I'm not, I don't have a personal relationship with. So sometimes I always wonder, like, I can be really casual with people I know, because that's who I am. They know me for me. But it's nice to know that I can. The best thing about this was to see that I'm on the right track, and that people. I know that your story is unique to you guys in terms of the unique makeup of it, but it's not unique in that South African schools, by and large, are all on the same path trying to do the same thing, and people need to know that. People often think they're all in their little silos, and
we're all just trying to beat each other's first rugby team. That's all we're really about, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's not the case. No. That's just the one of the stories.
Yeah.
So thank you. I mean,
I've had a great time. Thank you.
I appreciate this, and this is really cool.
Good luck. It's been very good. Thanks very much.
I'm hoping that we get a good traction.